Harry Anderson's life story feels almost like a grand magic trick in itself, filled with the glitz of television sitcom success, the gritty reality of hustling on city streets, and the unquenchable desire to perform feats that mystify and delight. He was one of those performers whose charm was impossible to ignore, the kind of guy you'd spot in a crowd and instantly sense he was up to something clever, maybe even a little mischievous, but never in a way that was off-putting. Instead, people gravitated to him. They wanted to see whatever he was going to do next, and that was precisely how he liked it. Though millions knew him best as Judge Harold T. Stone from the NBC sitcom Night Court, the truth is that Anderson always saw himself as a magician first, a conjurer who stumbled into television stardom almost by accident. Yet those who only knew him from his sitcom work rarely understood the depth of his dedication to card tricks, illusions, and the fascinating culture of street performers that shaped his youth and guided so many of his life choices. Born on October 14, 1952, in Newport, Rhode Island, Harry Anderson entered a family situation that was precarious at best. His father disappeared from the household early, leaving Harry and his mother alone. This set the tone for a childhood frequently uprooted. He recalled that by the time he turned 16, he'd already lived in a dozen different states. People who move around that much often learn quickly how to adapt, how to make the best of whatever environment they find themselves in. And Anderson had a special aptitude for doing exactly that. In the shifting sands of his childhood, he developed a keen radar for opportunities to connect with people, opportunities to amuse, and especially opportunities to learn something new. For him, that initial spark took shape in card games and street hustle magic. As a kid, he spent lonely days loitering in places like the lobby of the fabled Ambassador East Hotel, watching men play poker, place bets, and swap money back and forth with a mixture of skill and cunning. Despite the adult nature of these gatherings, the card shark somehow took a liking to this wide-eyed boy, teaching him games, bets, and eventually little card tricks. It was there that the seeds of his future in magic were planted. When Anderson was 16, his father resurfaced and offered him a place to stay in Los Angeles. He made the move, enrolled in North Hollywood High School, and discovered a world where his blossoming passion for illusions might thrive. In LA, he joined a small club for magic enthusiasts, rubbing shoulders with soon-to-be famous names like Paul Harris and Jonathan Pendragon. Imagine a teenage Harry Anderson already moving beyond simple card tricks into illusions that demanded dexterity and big laughs. He soon tasted a different brand of magic, street performance. On a trip to San Francisco, he came across a shell game hustler, a guy who stood on a busy sidewalk and challenged passers-by to pick which shell the pea was under. Simple in concept, devilishly hard to win. Something clicked in Anderson's brain. The combination of performance, deception, and easy money lit his imagination on fire. In typical Harry Anderson fashion, he wanted to figure out how to replicate this hustle, but with his own comedic and magical twists. He immediately began developing a shell game routine, trying to combine it with the illusions he was already perfecting. But hustling isn't for the faint of heart, and Anderson realized this the hard way. He had no team, no shills planted in the crowd to help him. If a person got furious about losing, or if the cops showed up, he had no backup at all. The job was solitary, and eventually it turned dangerous. One enraged customer broke Anderson's jaw, reminding him that street hustling carried real risks. He eventually decided to retool the shell game into a parody act instead of a full-blown con, wearing the persona of a quick-witted hustler named Harry the Hat. Rather than place bets, he asked for tips, cracking jokes and impressing with sleight of hand, but never taking money he didn't earn. It was a brilliant pivot, the same street hustle but recast as comedic theater, wrapping the viewer in laughter instead of anger. Anderson drew heavily on the personalities and energy he'd absorbed in the Ambassador East lobby, the bantering gamblers who always seemed to keep the upper hand, but still displayed a down-to-earth charm. He gave this persona a bit of a screwball twist, making sure audiences always felt in on the joke, never fleeced. They loved it. Word of Anderson's act spread, prompting invitations to perform at comedy clubs where the audiences were open to something a little different, a cross between old-school magic and a stand-up routine. Anderson, thrilled by the opportunities, refined his material and sharpened his comedic instincts in front of live crowds. His timing, which would become a signature aspect of his later television work, grew polished on those club stages. While many magicians put on airs of mystery and awe, Anderson took the exact opposite approach. He wanted you to think he was conning you, so your eyes were glued to his every move. The more he leaned into that persona, the more onlookers tried to catch him in the act. And of course, the more closely they watched, the more impressed and entertained they became. In 1970, Anderson graduated as valedictorian of his class at North Hollywood High and then took off to Ashland, Oregon, where he opened a small magic shop. By day, he'd tinker with illusions or try to spark the curiosity of passers-by. By summer, he'd perform at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, a cultural institution that draws huge crowds. It was there he attempted ever more dangerous illusions, determined to keep pace with the festival's theatrical productions. One year, while they staged the epic drama of Henry IV, Anderson decided he needed something even more spectacular to attract festival goers to his own show. The result? A bullet catch stunt. He had his assistant fire a gun at him, and he caught the bullet in his teeth, leaving onlookers flabbergasted. It was precisely the kind of risk-taking, show-stopping trick that appealed to Anderson's flair for the dramatic. Year after year, he refined these magic acts, never content with the status quo. When the festival ended, he'd hit the road, loading up a car or hitching rides, traveling across the country to places like New Orleans, New York City, San Francisco, and Texas, performing wherever crowds gathered. If a local college campus looked lively, he'd stake out a spot in the middle of the quad and just launch into his show. Passers-by would gather, watch, laugh, then toss money into a hat at the end. This nomadic lifestyle brought both freedom and uncertainty, but it also built Anderson's reputation among magic aficionados. The Magic Castle in Los Angeles, the mecca for magicians worldwide, took notice. During the early 1980s, Anderson made an annual pilgrimage to LA to perform a week's worth of gigs at the Magic Castle. Then he'd vanish again, back to the street corners and festivals. It all changed in 1980 when a talent manager happened to see him at the castle and recognized a huge opportunity. Anderson's comedic persona and crowd-winning flair were perfect for larger stages. That manager arranged for Anderson to open for country star Kenny Rogers in Las Vegas at a weekly rate that far exceeded what he could make on the street. Soon, television producers began calling. He made appearances on The Mike Douglas Show, The Merv Griffin Show, and eventually Saturday Night Live. Anderson's third time on SNL featured him performing a trick where he appeared to push a needle straight through his arm. Even though he assured viewers it was just a trick, the visual was gruesome enough that people watching at home gasped. Anderson, ever the showman, didn't mind horrifying the crowd a bit as long as they were simultaneously entertained. He had learned from those card sharks decades earlier. If you're going to take people's money, whether through a street hustle or a show, you'd better leave them smiling. Among the producers who caught Anderson's act was Les Charles, known for the series Taxi. Charles was developing a new show for NBC called Cheers, Centered on a Boston bar and its quirky cast of regulars, Anderson's persona of a streetwise conman fit perfectly. He was cast in a few episodes during the show's first season, popping in as a smooth-talking hustler who'd swindle the bar patrons with small-time cons. Though the part was minor, he made such an impression that Night Court producer Reinhold Weege took note. When Night Court was in development, Weege asked if Anderson might read for the lead, a young, playful judge who adored magic and looked up to the older generation with reverent nostalgia. Anderson reportedly replied, "I am this guy. I'm exactly who you've written here." And just like that, a star was born. Night Court premiered in 1984 and ran for 9 seasons, making Anderson's Judge Harold T. Harry Stone a household name. The show's brand of humor, whimsical, irreverent, yet grounded in the camaraderie of court employees working late into the night, struck a chord with viewers. Here was a judge who wore sneakers under his robes, performed magic tricks in the courtroom, and displayed a naive but earnest sense of fairness. Anderson's comedic timing was razor sharp, honed through years of stand-up, street magic, and the random experiences that shape a performer who spent half his life on the move. The role seemed tailor-made for him, because it essentially merged the show's comedic needs with his real-life passion for illusions. Audiences loved him for it, and Night Court thrived. Anderson picked up further television work, including the sitcom Dave's World, based loosely on the life of columnist Dave Barry, but Night Court would remain the crown jewel of his acting career. Deep down, though, he never fully shed the feeling that he was a magician first, an actor second. He confessed that he had never planned on becoming a TV star and was somewhat startled by the fame it brought. Whenever he appeared on a talk show, be it The Tonight Show, Late Night, or others, he made sure to include a bit of magic in his routine. If the host gave him a standard interview question like, "What's new with you?" he might pivot and produce a deck of cards or banter about cons and hustles while pulling coins from behind the host's ear. It was both a calling card and a reminder, remember, I'm still that guy. Acting is great, but magic is in my veins. That mindset was showcased grandly in 1985 when he hosted Saturday Night Live. Typically, hosts deliver a monologue, crack jokes about current events, or poke fun at themselves. But Anderson did a shocking illusion where he appeared to eat a live guinea pig. Of course, it was a trick, but it underscored his desire to keep pushing boundaries, to keep audiences off balance exactly the way a top-tier magician does. Yet while Night Court soared and Anderson reaped the benefits of being a popular sitcom lead, an unease took root in him. The public eye can be harsh. Fans constantly approached him in restaurants or grocery stores, expecting Harry Stone from Night Court to chat and amuse them. He'd sign autographs and grin on camera, but the more famous he became, the more he pined for a simpler life. Maybe one that looked more like the carefree days of traveling and street performance. So when Night Court ended in 1992, Anderson took the opportunity to make a drastic change. He packed up and moved his family to a small town in Oregon, slipping away from the frenzy of Hollywood. Although he did take another shot at sitcom life with Dave's World, by the year 2000 he was no longer chasing acting roles with the same vigor. Friends recall him talking about how he missed the raw authenticity of magic. He admired how Penn and Teller, who had started around the same time as he did, managed to build a massive following that soared far beyond illusions on a street corner. Meanwhile, he'd spent a decade juggling sitcom scripts instead of playing with a deck of cards. He couldn't help wondering what might have been if he'd stayed in the magic world. And so, Anderson decided to correct course. His heart told him it was time to stop dabbling in show business and return to magic full-time. He turned his gaze toward New Orleans, a city whose vibrant street performer culture, colorful nightlife, and bohemian energy seemed tailor-made for someone like him. He purchased an old building in the French Quarter that happened to have a dark and storied past. Lee Harvey Oswald had once lived there. Ever the showman, Anderson transformed the building into a nightclub he called Oswald's Speakeasy, a tongue-in-cheek nod to its history. Night after night, he performed a one-man show for about 90 minutes, weaving illusions, comedic banter, and the kind of intimate performance style that thrives in a small venue. Attendees got up close enough to see the sweat on his brow, close enough to be astounded when they still couldn't figure out his illusions. Locals became devoted fans, and tourists who recognized him from Night Court were happily surprised to find themselves watching the kind of offbeat magic show that you'd never see on a Hollywood soundstage. Alongside Oswald's Speakeasy, Anderson opened a more private showroom named Spade and Archer, a nod to the detective agency from the Maltese Falcon. Inside, he displayed an eccentric collection of carnival, magic, and gambling memorabilia, items that spoke to his passion for the hustle, for illusions, and for that sense of danger and delight that comes when you try to outsmart the system. Wandering through the space felt like stepping into Anderson's private world, curated from the best bits of his travels and experiences. It was a reminder of the life he'd once led on the road, enthralling random passers-by with illusions and side-splitting jokes. He also found a community in New Orleans. Street performers known as quarter rats took to him immediately. He belonged among them, a bit of a drifter, a guy who didn't crave paparazzi attention, content to mingle with jugglers, painters, tarot card readers, and magicians who'd set up camp in the French Quarter. He opened his home to them, forging friendships that were based on mutual respect for the performer's life and a shared love of the city's distinctive culture. For a while, life seemed to have come full circle. He was back to living life on his own terms, doing illusions, fostering a small community around him, and letting the hustle and bustle of the big entertainment world pass him by. Then Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005. The devastation to the city was staggering. Entire neighborhoods were flooded, businesses struggled to stay open, and tourism, the lifeblood of the French Quarter, dried up in the crisis. For someone like Anderson, who depended on a steady influx of curious visitors, the aftermath was dire. Worse, day-to-day life in a ravaged city proved nearly impossible. Access to electricity, clean water, and basic public services became tenuous, if available at all. The tragedy sapped the city's vibrant energy, replacing it with chaos and hardship. Anderson found himself in a place he loved dearly, but one that could no longer sustain him or his shows. In 2006, he was assaulted in the French Quarter, his second attack since moving there. It felt like a final omen that it was time to leave. He and his wife made the painful decision to pack their belongings and move, leaving behind the unique circle of friends and fellow performers they'd bonded with. It was a crushing blow, but also a realistic choice in the wake of so much tumult. His later years found him living in Asheville, North Carolina, seeking a quieter pace of life. He still performed magic, but on a schedule he could control. None of the frantic hustle of talk shows or sitcom shoots. None of the intense demands of club owners in a major city. He seemed content to occupy a smaller stage, as long as that stage was fully his own. Friends and fans would occasionally coax him into doing illusions or sharing stories from his Night Court days, and he was typically happy to oblige with a grin that suggested all the ups and downs had been worth it. The man had crisscrossed America doing illusions on street corners, broken into the biggest comedic stages on television, then walked away and created a small magic empire in New Orleans, only to move on again. Through it all, he managed to retain his singular sense of identity, that of a con artist with a heart of gold, a street magician who never fully bought into stardom, a restless soul who was always happiest when crowds were laughing and shaking their heads in amazement. Tragically, on April 16th, 2018, Harry Anderson passed away at the age of 65, found in his home in Asheville. News of his death stunned fans worldwide. People remembered his comedic gifts, his warm presence, and the comedic verve he brought to Night Court and Cheers, not to mention his cameo appearances on shows like Saturday Night Live. But for those who had followed his journey more closely, the loss hit extra hard. Here was a performer who had poured so much creativity into his illusions, his comedic hustle, and the unwavering sense of fun he brought to every project he touched. If you were in his orbit, even briefly, you got a sense that he was genuinely one of a kind, a man who balanced the cynicism of con artistry with a truly generous spirit. Those who knew him or worked with him often repeated the same ideas, that he was bright, quick, refreshingly unpretentious, and brimming with childlike wonder in a world that can often be grim. As so many discovered, he never seemed to outgrow the sense of wonder that first enchanted him in those dusty lobbies filled with gamblers and hustlers. He might have had grown-up responsibilities, a family, a mortgage, and eventually the weight of fame, but he never lost the part of him that believed in laughter and illusions as a form of magic that can bridge the gap between human beings. Looking back on his path, one notices how each chapter in Anderson's life contained both triumph and struggle. On one hand, we see a man who conquered the world of television, starring in a widely beloved sitcom that endures in reruns to this day, bringing new waves of fans who discover the offbeat brilliance of Night Court for the first time. On the other hand, we see the personal toll that fame took on him, a yearning to return to the simpler, more authentic practice of magic in front of a live, unsuspecting crowd. Hollywood glitz might offer money, but it can't offer the thrill of pulling off a flawless shell game under the watchful eyes of 100 strangers on a San Francisco street corner. Anderson learned that no form of success is free of cost. His story reveals that he was never one to chase celebrity for its own sake. Rather, he chased the chance to enthrall, to provoke laughter and curiosity, to set up a clever con that let people walk away smiling rather than fuming. Moreover, his story offers a glimpse into a side of magic that's often overshadowed by grand illusions and million-dollar stage productions in Las Vegas. Harry Anderson's bread and butter was smaller-scale magic, witty and personal, rooted in the centuries-old tradition of street performers. The hustle, the patter, the brash persona, and the delight when the mark realizes they've been had, but loved every minute of it anyway. Those were central to his craft. Even when he was fully immersed in acting, he never let the world forget that magic was his origin story. It's even more revealing that when Night Court ended and the question of what next loomed before him, he made the decision that many in his position would have avoided: to walk away from big city glitz and escape to Oregon and then New Orleans for a quieter but more personal, creative life. That sense of autonomy is not always easy to come by, particularly when you've sampled the high life of network TV success. For many fans, hearing about his life in the French Quarter, opening a quirky nightclub, forging friendships with local artists, even living in an apartment once inhabited by Lee Harvey Oswald, seems straight out of a novel. But it showcases Anderson's insatiable attraction to people, places, and stories that carried a hint of mystery or a dash of the macabre. He took pleasure in leaning into the weird or the darkly humorous side of American culture. From the repertoire of illusions he performed, some downright creepy, to the historical oddities he chose to highlight in his venues. It was all part of the same spirit that once made him a kid enthralled by gamblers, or a teenage hustler perfecting the shell game. He never shied away from the fringe, and by forging his own path, he embraced it wholeheartedly. The public saw the comedic star, the slightly goofy judge with a dash of magic, or the cameo hustler in Cheers. But beyond that comedic exterior lived a performer who studied the psychology of illusions with real rigor, who devoured the history of carnival sideshows and old-time gambling cheats, and who was determined to pass on that knowledge, whether by performing or by curating it in private showrooms. Magic fans know him as someone who shaped the conversation around close-up illusions, bridging the old traditions of hustling with the modern forms of comedic performance. Younger street magicians and comedic illusionists still recount how watching Harry Anderson's TV spots influenced them, how it expanded their sense of what magic could be. He might not have reigned over the Strip in Las Vegas or had a multi-million-dollar illusion spectacle, but his approach was no less impactful in forging new links between stage magic, street hustle, and comedic monologues. When he died in 2018, the tributes poured in. Co-stars from Night Court reminisced about what a privilege it was to act beside him. Magic aficionados recounted how his illusions and comedic routines influenced an entire subculture, and everyday fans shared stories of seeing him on the street, in a small comedy club, or at the Magic Castle. They spoke of a man who genuinely listened, who took the time to connect rather than bask in fame. And yes, they spoke of illusions, like that infamous needle-through-arm gag, or the bullet catch, or the shell game routine that could leave you laughing in disbelief. That was Anderson's special gift, turning a stunt that might otherwise elicit horror or suspicion into a comedic highlight of the evening. He was a performer who cut across boundaries, comfortable in front of a swanky Hollywood crowd, as well as a circle of curious onlookers in some random town square. In each environment, he was playful and gracious, aware that the real magic lay in that instant when the audience gasps, then bursts into laughter. And though he's gone, he remains deeply present in the nostalgia of those who loved Night Court, who remember the quirky, big-hearted judge with a fascination for Mel Torme. He lives on in the stories of street performers who still talk about Harry the Hat and how his hustle-turned-comedy routine changed the game. He exists in the annals of magic, a figure revered for bridging the gap between con artistry and respectful showmanship. And he resonates in the comedic world, a reminder that if you can make people laugh and gasp at the same time, you've created something very special indeed. So hats off, and watch out for the hidden card in the brim, to the man who turned the shuffle of a deck into a stepping stone for an entire life of illusions and laughter. Harry Anderson might not be physically present, but the spirit of his act, that sly grin, and the memory of those impossible feats continue to enchant anyone who glimpses the highlights of his remarkable journey. And though we may say goodbye, Harry, we do so believing that wherever he is, he's probably ready to pull one more trick.